My name is Samantha Mirabal. I'm with Melco's application team, and this is our DesignShop Talk. We try to get together on a weekly basis to see what questions we can answer. Running a little bit late today because OBS, our little system, decided to be a pain on my computer, so I had to do some updates. Anyway, apologize for that. So let me go get the feeds so I can see any questions that are asked and do that. If you see me looking off to the side, I'm just keeping track of the different questions to make sure I can see what's going on. All right, so got the Facebook one. Let's mute it. There. On my computer, so I have to do some update. There. Excellent. So I have Facebook. What about YouTube? Let's fix the YouTube one so I can see that. And then we are, there it is, live. Nope, quiet. Okay, great. So now I can see any comments that are typed in on both YouTube and Facebook. All right, so I'll bounce between them. Good morning. Yes, it is a beautiful morning here. All right. So as I was saying, my name's Samantha. If you have questions, feel free to type them in on the comments. I'll bounce back and forth between Facebook and YouTube just to double check and see what's going on there. If you have questions ahead of time, you can email them to applications@melco.com. So let's go ahead and get right into it. First few questions are kind of just discussion topics. So first one was, should I do anything different if I'm using metallic thread? So yes, in general, when working with metallic threads, things that you'll want to consider is slowing the machine down. Don't want to run it as fast as humanly possible. Slow it down, under 1,000. It really depends on what thread brand you're using and things like that. I've done it anywhere from 700 to 1,000. But you're going to have to look at what threads you're using to decide that. So I would, as a general rule, slow the machine down, increase your active feed because that's going to make the thread a little bit looser and help stop it from snapping. Okay, so you'll want to increase your active feed from what you would use with your traditional polyneon thread or a polyester thread. So increase that, and also go up in needle size. By having a larger needle size, it'll help protect the thread as it's going through the fabric because you'll have a larger hole, and the thread can kind of sink into the needle, the groove, a little bit better to help protect it. Someone did type one in. It says, I do patches. Is there an easier way to cut out patches like the cut and scan? There's a lot of ways to do them. I do a lot of them by hand, and I also cut them on my laser. So if that's a completely separate piece of equipment, but laser cutting gives you a nice sealed edge, particularly if you're using polyester or synthetic fabrics, not necessarily polyester. But the synthetic fabrics will kind of burn around the edge and stop it from fraying. I've seen people use regular fabric cutters like a Silhouette, a Cricut, or an Eye-Align. Those are all cutters. The scanning cut I've not used personally, so I assume it would work the same way. You would print out your design, scan it through there, cut it, and then bring it over. A neat little trick that you can always use is like if you have a template, and you're using a product like maybe Applique Magic that has a paper backing on it, so you can actually take the template, lay it straight on there, trace it, and then cut it with scissors. I'll say personally, I use pre-cut fabrics by cutting them in a laser or a fabric cutter, or I just do them in the hoop by hand. It's kind of the ways I would suggest it. So we talked about metallic thread. We did put a link in the comments for you so that you can check those out. All right, good morning, and Sail Captain 86 on YouTube. Good morning. All right, so another question we had is, should I set a maximum on my auto active feed? As a general rule, no. What you have is fine, so leaving it there. On some edge cases, if you're doing some interesting type things and you're noticing you're having a runaway type effect where the active feed number just keeps going up and up and up, then okay, put a maximum setting there. But as a general rule, you shouldn't need to do that. Let's see. What is the best way to get smaller fonts to sew straight on a nylon dog collar? So if you haven't worked with that type of webbing before, it tends to shift around, right? As you're sewing through it, the fibers move, which depending on how you have it stabilized, the collar itself can start drifting, which is why your letters don't end up straight. So when you're working with those sorts of applications, it's critical that you sew center out, okay, and not from one side to the other, because that's going to help avoid it continuing to push the nylon around and causing it to change directions. It'll help keep it straight. If you've got, 14 inches of text to do on there, you don't want to do it all in one line. You want to kind of take it in segments, center out, center out, center out. That'll help prevent that movement, the movement on there. So you would want to make sure you're using a good needle, that you're stabilizing it well, and you're hooping it well. So I know with a lot of the dog collars, using clamps, you clamp it, pull it nice and taut, and clamp it down. You don't really want to float them because, again, what's causing that to look like it's twisting is that the collar itself is moving. So you need to prevent that. I've used little tricks before, which you shouldn't have to do this if you hoop well, but you can, do a running stitch on each end to help hold at least that steady. Those are little tricks you can play with, but really hoop it well, use some good stabilizer, and sew center out. Okay, sharp needles are also helpful. Okay, so no other questions typed in so far on either. Good morning. Okay, so how do I stop caps from doing this? So this particular question had some other stuff. It said, hey, when I sew on one brand of cap, it's fine. But when I sew on this particular cap, I think it's a Richardson, I get the stair-stepping look on there. So that's being driven. So you can see stair-stepping in a few things. So obviously, easy things to check is make sure your maintenance is up to date, that your cable tensions are all right, that your cap driver doesn't need adjustment. So assuming all that's fine, and which I would assume is the case in this one, because this person said that it sews perfect on one cap that's not as rigid, but on this cap it's doing this stair step. So that stair step you can see on fabrics that are very aggressive, so that have a strong texture to it. As the thread or needle penetration goes on one side of that rib, if you will, on the fabric to the other, it'll appear like it's a stair step like this. So things you can do in this case, my guess would be it's being driven by the buckram on the back. So that buckram it's kind of like sewing through rebar. I mean, it's really rough stuff. It's got a very distinct texture to it. And as it jumps the threads, you can't go through a piece of the buckram. It's going to jump from one side to the other, which is what's causing that. So, I mean, you can try some squirrely things like softening the buckram using a steam. You can try adding an edge walk in your design, digitizing, to help that, and use a topper. All of those are things that can help. But if it's being driven by the fact that it's just laying on one side of the texture versus the other, there's not a whole lot of fixes for that. Okay, so that's kind of what I would look at is first make sure your machine maintenance is good, that you have all the cable tensions tight. Your X cable is not super loose, for instance. Same with the cap driver. And then make sure the digitizing is clean. Use a topper, edge walks. Those are all sorts of techniques you can use. But if it's the texture, really, you've got to kind of soften up that texture somewhat. All right. I saw people talking about adjusting a needle for hats. What were they talking about? Okay, so when working with hats, types of things to think about are using the right needle, right? So using a sharp needle. Hats, you can use balls, but hats always sew a little bit better with sharps in my experience. So using a sharp needle. You can also look at, depending on what's going on. So let's say you're sewing with a 7511 and you're getting a lot of needle deflection, right? So the needle, I brought props. So your needle is actually bending as it's sewing, right? So they bend. So if you're getting needle deflections, going up in size can help minimize those deflections. All right. And by minimizing the deflections, you'll get it running through the design a little bit better. So really looking at sharps, larger size needles. Depending on what you're doing, again, let's say you're getting needle break, you're using a coated needle, like a Teflon coated needle, all right? So those things, it's a little counterintuitive, but if you're getting needle breaks, sometimes just going to a regular needle will allow the needle to deflect just enough to avoid breaking, because that extra coating on the needle actually stiffens it more. So, sometimes just changing to a regular needle rather than a coated needle can be helpful, but really it's, sharps and then needle size. Start with a 7511 sharp and go up from there. Okay, so what else? Can you discuss the importance of the presser foot and how to use it correctly? So the presser foot, first off, what does a presser foot do for you? Okay, I told you I brought props. So let's go to full screen, maybe, if I can figure out how to do that. There. Yeah. All right. So we've got, this is our presser foot. I just took it off one of my machines. Not the presser foot. This is the needle plate. And you've got your fabric you're sewing through, needles going through that all. So when what your presser foot does is it sits down on top of this to hold it still as your needle goes through and back up, right? Because if it's not still as the needle's going through, the fabric's going to bounce. And if it bounces, that's going to rub on the thread, causing a thread break, right? It's going to rough up the thread and possibly result in thread breaks. So what your presser foot is supposed to be doing is holding this sandwich still so that the needle can come in and out without it moving. Okay, so once the needle's out of it, then the presser foot lifts up, moves to the next position, in and out again. All right, so what your presser foot wants to do is you want to make sure that it's just grazing the surface of your material. All right, so depending on what you're sewing, let's say you're sewing on a shirt, maybe that's your presser foot all the way down to 1 or 2 clicks up, right? That might be what works there. Things that you would notice if it's too low, you can see the presser foot actually causing, how you have hoop burn? Well, you can also see that same effect when it comes to the presser foot, where you get kind of a ghosting around your embroidery from the presser foot itself. That goes away with water, but you can avoid it just by making sure your presser foot's not too low to start with. If you're sewing through puff, right? Puff is really thick. So you don't want to have it being crushed by the presser foot, right? So you don't want to crush it down, because the whole point of puff is to get that kind of 3D effect. So making sure that your presser foot is all the way up or as high as you can put it, so that you're not needlessly crushing your puff down. Okay, same with with Minky. Let's say you're sewing on a blanket. You want to kind of tack all that texture down before you embroider on it, while having the presser foot a little lower. Now, one of the things that you can notice why people start talking about presser foot's foot height so much generally is in reference to hats. Because when you have a hat hooped on your arm, the hat is actually at an angle, right? That's backwards there. It's at the brim's here, so yeah, it's at an angle like that. So depending on where you are on that hat, actually, it's the other way. Anyway, sorry, I'm thinking about this too hard. Your presser foot can actually deflect. So if your presser foot's too low and it hits on the incline of the hat, what'll happen? It'll slide forward into your needle, causing a needle break. So picking up your presser foot to make sure that you're not deflecting the presser foot itself into the needle is important. So the presser foot also can cause, by having flagging, which flagging is when your material is bouncing around as the needle's going in and out. So if you have flagging, that can also cause false thread breaks. Okay, so making sure your presser foot is just grazing the material is important, right? For proper sew quality, for all kinds of reasons. Okay, so another question we had, there is a link in the description over here, or in the comments, that shows, talks about the presser foot, so you have that as a reference. So another question is, how do you use Applique Magic backing? So if you're not familiar with the Applique Magic, I don't actually have any here to be able to, but I have a similar type item that I have on these patch blanks that I cut. So Applique Magic is basically, it's a pressure peel and stick adhesive, if you will. It's got a little bit of structure to it, and what you'll do with it is you'll take your fabric that you're going to use for an applique piece, and you'll grab Applique Magic, lay it together, go put it in your heat press per the instructions, heat it together, which this is already cut to shape, but imagine you have a large piece. And then what you end up with is a nice kind of paper backing that you can draw on. So if you want to pre-cut shapes, you can draw it out on there and cut it out. But the net effect is you have a peel and stick. So the one I use, or that I had handy for you, is clear, not paper, which Applique Magic is. But now it's peel and stick, right? So what that allows you to do is peel it, lay it down in the hoop. If it's pre-cut like this, you just stick it down, and now you don't have to pin it. You don't have to use spray adhesives. Spray adhesives are gross. They get everywhere, so just be careful if you're using those. But it's really nice for the embroiderer, right? So by using your Applique Magic, you can tack it down, trim it, and now this won't shift around when I go to sew. Okay, so that's what that's for. How to use it: basically heat press it to your fabric, then go either lay it and peel the paper off, stick it down, trim it into the shape, and then finish your embroidery design, things like that. Any other questions? I'm going to quick look on both the platforms. I don't see any over here. All right, so moving on. What causes false thread breaks? All right, so false thread breaks, things to think about. One, bobbin tension. Make sure your bobbin tension is right, okay? There is a bobbin tension gauge that is really handy, particularly if you're not good with the yo-yo, where, dropping it to see if you get the right tension on your bobbin case itself. But making sure your bobbin tension's not too loose, that it's the right, that's number one. Number two, making sure that your active feed's not too high. If your active feed is too high, lowering it just a few points will tighten up the thread so that it's actually sensing the thread and not thinking it's a break when there's no break. Okay, so that's another thing to consider. Your presser foot. If your presser foot is too high and your material's flagging, the sensor actually can think that you have a thread break when you don't. Okay, so that's another thing. Check your presser foot, check your settings. So your active feed setting, make sure it's not too high, bobbin tension. Those are the key things. Also, when doing maintenance, if the 2 million stitch count maintenance, you've got to go oil all those needle bars. When you're doing that, be careful. In the middle, if you actually look through for the upper needle bars, you'll see there's a circuit card there. All right, don't oil the card. Electronics don't like to be wet. Oil the needle bar, not the card. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your maintenance. You don't want to oil electronics. You want to oil, mechanically moving parts. Okay, because that can affect, that card is your thread break sensor. That's the electronics for that sensor in the middle, the front of your machine. That's where it all routes to go into the main computer of the machine. Okay, so don't get it wet. All right, when a new laser is popped in, so that you're switching out the laser, why does it shine as a line, not as a dot? Okay, so a few things. First thing I would look at, and pardon my messy setup here, and this right here is your cover on the right hand side. You remove that with these 4 screws here, and there's a little screw down here, and you'll pull off that cover. If you look at this cover, which you can see I've over greased it, ignore that. Down here, if you take that off, you'll notice on the back side there's a little hole right here. If you get dust in that hole, which, you're embroidering, where every time you stab through fabric, you're going to produce some lint, right? So there's dust that's produced in embroidery all over the place. So, yeah, the hole's visible. So this hole right there is what the laser's actually shining through. So if you take this cover off, clean it well. And I would remove, if there's any oil on here or dust in this hole, blow it out. Just wipe that off, right? Because that's not going to help anything with regards to the laser. That hole's actually right down here. Can't see it on this side. That's why I have it lined up with the pink, so you could actually see it here. All right, so making sure that's clean. If you do remove this cover, remember, put it back before you do anything else with your machine, okay? You don't want to change needles or do anything like that without having this cover on. You will not be happy with that, okay? Another thing is when you actually install the laser. All right, there are two little screws here. It's not just screw it in place and go. You actually have to line it up with your needle plate. So like I said, I brought the needle plate here, but you can see on the machine, here it is. So when your cover's off, you've got it kind of tightened in. You can either put a piece of tape where you can still see the hole and the dot. That's what the instructions suggest. I usually am lazy and just use a piece of paper or something that I have on hand and just move it back and forth. But what you want is that laser dot to be perfectly through that hole, not touching the sides of it, not anywhere else. So before you even put the cover on, make sure it's lined up. Now, there is a procedure in the tech manual where if you need to go through and actually focus the laser, there's instructions in there. Honestly, new lasers, I've never seen them not show up as a dot. So if I had to guess, it's either hitting the side of your that black cover, or there's dust in the way or something of that nature. So those are the things I would check. Is one, make sure your cover's clean, and then two, make sure you have it aligned correctly to the hole in the needle plate. Okay. They did put a link in the comments on false thread breaks, so if you want to see more info on that, there's some resources there for you. Okay, so basically you just loosen these screws around, move it around until you center it, and there is a link there showing how to do that. So how do you merge one design with another? That's another question we had. No others typed on YouTube, nor here. Okay, so let's go over to DesignShop and do that. So I'm going to go open a design, maybe. On the C drive, designs, let's open one day. Okay, so let's say I want to sew one day, but I also want to sew, all right, this is not cohesive, but same idea. All right, so let's say I want to sew this, but I want to put another design with it. A few ways you can do it. You could do insert file, and then go find whatever file you want. So let's say I want to do this star. Say open, it'll put it in here. So now I just position it however I want. And now I have the two different files in here. I can center it and it's all ready to sew. I've got my 4 color changes for this, my 3 color changes for the star, and we're good to go. So you can do it that way, or let's say I have a new file. I'm gonna go again, open my one day, and I'm also gonna go, oops, that was one day. I gotta close it first before I reopen it, huh? All right, so I'm gonna go open up one day, and then I'm also gonna go open up the star or something else. It really doesn't matter. All right, so I'm just gonna do the star since I did that one already. All right, so you select everything. So over on your project view here, if you click on the top, this where it says design, that selects everything. Another way, you can do Control A on your keyboard, and that will select everything. But once it's all selected, you can do Control C, which is copy, or you can do edit, copy. It does the same thing. Then go to your other file, Control V, paste it, or edit, paste, and just paste them in. So you can do edit, paste, and now we got multiple stars going. Okay, and then you can just position it wherever you want. So that's merging designs together. Let me close that. Let's see what else we got. Where are my questions? Oh, there. Okay. How do you do a continuous outline? So let's say you're doing this, and now we want to trace all around it. So I'm going to kind of, really it's a puzzle, right? So you got to work your way through a design, thinking about how you're going to go through there. Use your walks, your retraces, your bean stitches, your satin stitches. You want to just think about using all those and paying attention to your starts and stops to make sure you can path your way around the design without having to have trims, okay? So I'll pull up the frog, but here, let's look at one thing first, because I've got, I had these all opened, and then I had, oops, not there, teaching, up one, and then I had to reboot everything, because, there. Digitizing. Turn that off. All right. So when working around a design, if I just look at this right here, right? All that black stuff is touching. So there's no reason I can't go ahead and digitize that entire thing without having a single trim in it. And that's because you just have to plan your way around it. So for instance, I could start where this green circle, this dot is, and I could do a satin stitch across here, right? Okay, so that would get me across the first wave. I need to go from here to over here. That's going to get covered up later, so I can just do a running stitch and do a running stitch over, and then do another satin stitch, which is like these columns up and over. Well, then do a walk stitch down. Remember, your walking stitch is just what you would use to travel, right? So if I just follow my arrows, all right, I can do my walking stitch down, and then I can switch over to a column and do my column up and over. Okay, so now I have a column. Well, that column ended where the propeller is, but now I need to go down to here. So I'm going to again do a running stitch to get me from that propeller to down here, where I can then again do a column starting near that propeller and just working my way around the design. See this? So it's just a matter of working through, I like to think of them as puzzles, right? That you're kind of working your way around, paying attention to your starts and stops so that you don't have needless trims, right? So, all right, we walked down, we did our satin across here. Well, now I'm going to come down. So again, do a walk stitch just to travel down to the next spot. And again, work your way through it. So if I go look at the froggy, my graphic, all right. So when you're looking at something like this, what do? Well, think about it, right? So just like on that one day, I pathed myself around it, trying to figure out where I'd start, where I'd end, how I get through it, making sure any of those travel stitches get covered up. Well, if you're trying to do something like this, whoa, I'm dropping stuff here, so that it's all line work, something like this, well, what do? Well, first off, think about how you're going to go through it. So let's say I start here and I do a running stitch all the way around it, right? Just a walk stitch. So if I turn off this guy, you'll see all that is it's a run stitch all the way around. So that's one piece of thread traced around. Okay. Well, then what do I do from there? Well, this stuff, I'm going to have to go back over that at another point. So you just literally pay attention to your starts and stops and just work your way through it. So if I turn these off and just walk you through it, I've got my trace around it. Then I did a walk stitch, which is one piece of thread. Now, when you're doing these type of line works, you want to make sure that you have 4 plus or minus 1 thread, if you will, at every location, because that's what's going to make it look nice and thick. So as you're tracing your way around, you got to keep in kind of a running thought going of how many pieces of thread you have. Well, if you look here, this is 1, but up when it got to the seam on the frog's leg, I went over it 1, 2, 3, 4. So each location ended up with 4 pieces of thread without having to use a retrace or anything like that. I went back over it multiple times to make it look thicker. And I also don't like the points. This is a personal preference. I like the sketchy look, so kind of like a pencil. So if you put all the points on top of each other, you're not going to get that kind of more organic look. So by separating them and making sure they're kind of offset a little bit, one, it'll look bolder because the points aren't all on top of each other. Plus, you can kind of get a sketch look going. All right, so I started here, ran up, went back and forth. It ended where that red X is. So what's next? Well, start there and do a running stitch down. That's just this one here. And that's a bean stitch because I had 1 piece of thread going up. And now I do 3 pieces of thread because a bean of 3 is there. So what does that mean? I've got 4 pieces of thread in this location, 4 up here. So this whole segment, I don't need to go back over it again. All right, it's been done. Well, then what? All right. Start, up. So that's a walk and a walk down. So that gives me a few pieces of thread here, 1 there, which I already had 1. So now I've got 2. So literally you just work your way around the design so that you're paying attention to those starts and stops. You're thinking about how how it goes. So when it's all done, there are no trims. As you're doing these type of activities where you're pathing your way around, you want to go back and check your trims, right? And how I always do that is right here, you'll see Update Auto Trim. That will go through and recalculate everything. And notice my entire froggy sews without trims until it gets to the details on the mouth up here. So you see it's still sewing now. It did the eyes, so there were trims for that one, which makes sense. That's in the middle of nothing. It's not touching black, so it's going to have a trim to sew it. The eyeballs, again, are not touching anything, but they're going to have a trim on each one of those. Okay, so it's really just work your way through the puzzles. Figure out where you're going to go. Think about using a walk and using your retrace. So if you've not used those, this is your walk. Left clicks are straight points, right clicks are curves. So that gives me one piece of thread all the way across there. If I use a retrace, what you'll see is it starts and stops at the same point, which means it'll walk out and walk back. Okay. So that will give you 2 pieces of thread. Well, then if you need 3, you can use a bean, right? So a bean of 3 will mean every location is going to go back and forth 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So you get 3 pieces of thread at every location. I was just sent a question. Any tips for winding your own bobbins? And I will come back to Judy. I see yours as well, but let's look at this one. So any tips for winding your own bobbins? So with that, I use a simplicity winder just because I got it on sale at Joann's. But things that I found is you can, of course, buy the metal bobbins that you wind. I like winding a whole bunch of them, and rather than using those heavy metal bobbins, which a lot of times what you'll see on those is you'll get some lashback because they're heavy. So you've got to use the spring inside the bobbin case with those. I don't like doing that. So what I tend to do is use nebs or clear plastic sided bobbins for my regular sewing, right? So when they run out, I just keep the clear plastic and kind of pile them up. And then when I go to wind them, now I have all these bobbins that I can wind on there. So just putting them on, winding whatever colors you want, that works really well. Filtech does sell pre-wound colored bobbins, so you can always get those. But really just take I think my Viking machine actually will accept them. So my Viking sewing machine, just home use type sewing machine, my bobbins fit on those as well. So I can use the same nebs, the NEBS plastic sided ones are the ones I like to use. But it really, you can buy the metal ones, reuse the plastic cores, any of that, and don't overwind them. If you overwind them, then they don't fit in the bobbin case. So that's one thing to think about. Typically bobbin thread is thinner than your top thread, but if you're going to, oh, I didn't know that. So Kelsey just posted that you can buy empty plastic bobbins from Filtech. That's cool. I didn't know that. So that's another source you can look. Like I said, I've always just bought the case of 144 white nebs, used them, and as I change them, because I'm sewing all the time, I just save them. So I consider those free. All right. Is there a quick key when switching from column to walk, or do you have to click on each icon every change? When I click on them so that people can see them, but there are keystrokes you can use. So I believe there's a video that was on this accelerator editor. I'll have to look, but you can actually go through and program your own codes for different things. So like a column, currently it's Control Shift and the number 5 on the keypad or on your keyboard. So you can do that. So basically you would know Control Shift and the number 5 is going to be a column. Your walk is, you can also see them up here. So your walk stitch is a Control Shift 2. So if you're going back and forth, you can just keep your hands on the keyboard, Control Shift 2 for walk. When you want the column, Control Shift 5, and just go back and forth on the keypad. If you don't like those particular codes, you can always go into that accelerator editor and make something that works better for you with the different digitizing tools. Okay. Let's see, what other questions do we have? How can I edit a design to tell it to stitch from the center out? Say you have a purchase design with lettering and it needs to sew center out. How do you get how do you get the lettering to do that? So if it's native to DesignShop, it's easy. So if you have an OFM file that you purchased and it's lettering, if you go into the properties of that, you can tell it to sew center out right here. So by telling it center out, that'll rearrange your starts and stops and make it so it sews center out. Now, if it's an expanded format, then you've got to kind of brute force it through. The easiest way is generally to ask the digitizer if they can make it sew center out. Otherwise, you've got to go through the expanded and literally rearrange all the elements. So if I take this just to kind of brute force it, I'll show you. If I convert that to wireframe, oops, before I do that, I should have made it so regular. So let me go make it so normal. And then, so let's say you don't have a native file. What do? Well, now each one of these is separate. So now I literally have to rearrange it. So let's say I want ERING or ring to sew first, and maybe I want E2. All right, so I would take those, left click and drag, and make those sew first. And then I want the T to sew. All right, so I like doing these with colors. So when I'm doing this sort of thing, I'll come over here, find the letter, give it a color, and I'll show you why in a minute. It just makes it easier for me to be able to drag things around. So I'll go through here, give them random colors, and I don't care what colors they are, because what I'm going to do then is on the right hand side, you'll see there's a plus and minus. If I collapse the colors, now rather than dragging things over my 125 elements, which we don't need that one, now I only have 8 color changes. So I know I want ERING to sew first, then I want the T that's red to sew next, and then the yellow, left click and drag, then the green, left click and drag, and then the purple. Now that will sew center out. So if I take that word that was sewing from left to right, now it's sewing center out. Okay? So when you're working with expanded files like that, it's not as straightforward as just click a button. You've got to actually rearrange the elements, but it's not that hard to do, as you see. You just find the elements over in your right-hand side, drag it around, and rearrange it to be in the order you want. Okay? They did put a link over in the comments for the accelerator editor. So that was for the question on how do you switch from column and walk quickly without having to always keep on coming back here. Like I said, I've taught myself just to come back to the icons because I do a lot of these videos, and that way people can actually see me click, whereas sometimes I forget to tell people which codes I'm doing on the keyboard. Okay? All right, what other questions? Oh, that was it. So those are all the ones I had. I'm going to quick look on both platforms and see if there's anything else exciting that you guys want to talk about. Good morning, everyone. Okay. I don't see any other questions. So I hope this was helpful for you. Be sure to send in your questions. Again, you can always type them on the comments. You can email them to applications@melco.com. Lots of resources out there for you. So check them out and let us know what you want to learn, and we'll try to get it covered for you. All right. Again, I'm Samantha, and I will be back on Thursday. So next Thursday, we do every other week. It's Thursday, Friday, Thursday, Friday. So next Thursday, we'll do the next DesignShop Talk and see what questions you have. So quick look and see if there's anything else. Oh, deciphering designs, awesome. Oh, you have another question. What is the finest and thickest thread in a needle in the bobbin that you can run? I've done some crazy stuff. I wouldn't recommend it, but let's see. The thickest I would recommend is like a Burmilano, which is it's a yarn. That would be, I think it's a size 12, a gauge 12. Polyester thread is normally a 40. When you go thinner, that's what you use for super fine details. So On your bobbins, I personally would run 40 weight to 60 weight thread and just leave it at that. I don't think I've ever attempted to put a thicker thread than that in the bobbin. Now on the top thread, I've done some crazy stuff. Again, some of it I wouldn't even suggest, where I've taken a bonded nylon thread and put it in a really big needle and sewed through vinyl. That was crazy. Don't do that. But yeah, the thickest thread I would say is going up to a 12, which is like your Burmalana. It's a yarn. You got to slow the machine down. In the bobbin itself, I would stay with a 40 weight or smaller. 40 or 60, your typical bobbin threads are usually 60 points. Okay. All right. Any other questions? I don't see any more on YouTube. Oh, here's another one. After converting object to wireframe, how can we save the expanded file again? Okay, so that lettering that I just converted over, so this is expanded. So when I save it off, it will stay that way till the end of time because it's already been converted over into a wireframe. So when you save that off, even though if you save it as an OFM, in the native file, it's still going to be an expanded wireframe format, right? So if you want it to save it as something else, like an EXP, you can do save as EXP. Otherwise, just saving it now after you convert to wireframe, it'll automatically save it as your wireframe. Oh, sorry, I misread your question. How can you save it as an expanded file? Save as, change this to an EXP or DST, whichever you prefer. I like the EXPs myself, but save it as an EXP and you're good to go. That will save it as an expanded. Okay. Gina, you've been wondering about the wing needles. Those are typically done for cut work, if I'm not mistaken. I've not sewn them on this in a while. I've used a boring needle, but maybe I'll buy one. I'll talk to the guy. I'll buy a few and try them. Like I said, I haven't done them. But I believe they're used for cut work, if I'm not mistaken. I'll put that on the list to think about for either covering a special topic, or I'll run some experiments once I get the needles in, but I'll order some and see what happens with them. But yeah, a boring needle is interesting. So a boring needle, you don't run thread through it. It's just blades on it. So it actually cuts the fabric as you're sewing. So those are interesting when you use them. But yeah, I'll see about buying the single wing. All right, I'll buy some and see. I haven't used them, so I can't really speak with any authority on those. Okay, I don't see any more here. Okay, I think that's all the questions I had. So again, send in any questions you have and we'll get them answered. I'll poll in the groups next, Tuesday or Wednesday, looking for any questions, and we'll try to get those answered for you. Oh, someone else. Sometimes when I convert an object to wireframe from the image breaks a lot. Do you have an idea? Yeah, so when wireframe conversions, particularly when you're going from an expanded format, can be messy. And the reason that is there's no wireframe. It's literally taking all your stitches, and the software is guessing at what the wireframe is, what the density is, how the stitches go, and trying to convert it over into a wireframe format. So a lot of times what you'll notice is the densities go away, any patterns that were in fills go away. Sometimes curves are not quite as curvy as they should be, things like that. And really the only fix to it is to go through and work your way through your design, cleaning it up. Generally, when I do wireframe conversions, I try to only convert the bare minimum necessary that I want to modify. So like if I have a big design and there's just one aspect of it that is annoying me, I'll just try to convert that small area because it's less cleanup work, right? The better way is to get the native OFM. So get the digitizing done directly in DesignShop, because then you have the wireframes, you have the math, you have all the properties that went into creating the stitches, right? And it's not having to guess and interpolate between it. So yeah, converting over to wireframe you can see, depending on the design, it can cause some issues. But it's really, you have to work through it and clean it up. Okay. All right, everybody. Sorry we got started a little late. We ran long today, so awesome. Hope this was helpful for you. I'll be back next Thursday to answer any other questions you might have. Other than that, happy sewing. Have a good weekend. It's ugly here. I'm in Florida. It's rainy, rainy, rainy. So enjoy yourselves, and I will talk to you